Israel Finkelstein is a leading figure in the archaeology and history of ancient Israel. Over 40 years of fieldwork and research, he has helped to change the way archaeology is conducted, the Bible is interpreted, and the history of Israel is reconstructed. I sat down with Israel over several sessions to talk about how a lifetime of work has informed the story of ancient Israel. Israel, welcome back one last time to Kiryat Yarim.
Hello, Matt.
Today is our final conversation in the series that we've been working on for about a year now. And in our previous conversation, we looked at the archaeology of the Persian and early Hellenistic periods, and now we're going to start to apply that to the biblical texts, fittingly to the later texts in the sequence that we call the Hebrew Bible: Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles. This will feature in our final conversation. So let's start with the problems with the sources.
The problem with the sources is basically that we don't have an anchor for dating these compositions. When we speak about Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles, then these are very important compositions because these are the later historiographic compositions in the Bible. And historiography is always interesting because it tells you something about the society, about the politics, about the geopolitical situation. It tells you a lot. So placing Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles properly chronologically, is very essential. The problem is that we don't have an anchor. We have already mentioned this before. To give an example from Chronicles, in the history of research, there are proposals to put Chronicles anywhere between the 6th and 3rd centuries BC. Even some said, and here I go back, far to the time of Baruch Spinoza in the 17th century. He was the first one to brilliantly, in my opinion, throw the possibility that Chronicles is a book that was composed by the Hasmoneans in order to serve Hasmonean needs in the second half of the 2nd century BC. So this is why, because we don't have an anchor and because we don't have enough extra biblical text, at least for the Persian and early Hellenistic, so then archaeology becomes really important.
What's the conventional wisdom for the dating of these texts?
The conventional wisdom in recent years has been to push as much, to put as many biblical compositions as possible. By the way, I'm not speaking only about Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles, also the priestly texts and post-priestly compositions, to put all this in the Persian and early Hellenistic period. So the fad in scholarship was 4th century, 3rd century BC. In fact, not only in recent years. This has been the situation in the last maybe half a century, if not more than that. You can start seeing this in the compositions, in the writings of Martin North, even in the middle of the 20th century. The question, of course, is whether this can be supported by the facts on the ground, because this is a very meaningful proposal to push so much biblical composition into the Persian and Hellenistic, because you remember our previous conversation, according to which the situation in Jerusalem and in Yehud, Judea, in the countryside, was of poor settlements with minimal demographic background, minimal population. So how to bridge the situation? Of course, one can argue that many of these texts were put in writing, composed in Egypt or in Babylonia, which is, of course, a possibility. But the problem is, for those who try to place many of them in the Persian and early Hellenistic, in the 4th and 3rd centuries, and in Jerusalem.
So the question then is the old question we've encountered on several occasions, the question of literacy and the ability to put together text like this. So can you tell us something about that possibility in Jerusalem after 586? When?
Absolutely. This is the most important question, the question of literacy, scribal activity. Because one can theorize a lot about, composition, big time composition of biblical texts in Jerusalem in the 3rd century or 4th century BC, but there must be some sort of evidence on the ground for this. Here we go into a very problematic situation regarding literacy, because in late monarchic times, we have already discussed this, there is expansion of scribal activity all over the kingdom of Judah, even to the fringe, a place like Arad in the Beersheba Valley in the south. There's this dissemination of writing, especially in the administration of the kingdom, in the military system of the kingdom. So this is until 586. Please remember that in 586, those who were deported from Judah were the literati. So there was a major blow to the whole bureaucratic administrative system of the kingdom after the destruction by the Babylonians. Now let me jump to the 2nd century BC. Again, there's very strong evidence for dissemination of writing, for scribal activity, composition, and of course we have all these rich extra biblical texts of the Hasmonean period, the 2nd century BC. Of course, the finds, the Qumran finds, they cover the period between the 2nd century, let's say, maybe late 3rd, but 1st century is BC, 1st century CE. So here we have very solid evidence for writing and scribal activity, so we are okay. But the question again is what happens between 586 and let's say 200 BC. I would even maybe push a little bit later, but I agree to settle on 200 BC. So again, we have about 4 centuries in between around 600 and 200 BC. Now I'm going to surprise you, my dear Matt. We have to turn to Hebrew writing, okay? There is almost no evidence of composition of Hebrew texts. Hebrew writing in Jerusalem and in Yehud, Judea, between 586 and 200 BC. Except for some sort of few characters on Yehud coins of the 4th century BC. There's almost nothing. There's nothing basically, almost nothing. Let me be on the safe ground and say almost nothing until the 2nd century. So what to do with this? One can continue claiming, big composition operation in Jerusalem, but how? So when you raise the question with biblical scholars, those who really try to push as many compositions as possible to the 4th and 3rd centuries BC, they argue that, well, we are not looking in the right place. There was this activity around the Temple Mount. So we have to imagine scribes, scholars of the Persian, Jewish scholars of the Persian and early Hellenistic, sitting in the Temple Mount in association with the temple and composing texts there. But then my question would be the same question that I asked you and our viewers when we spoke about scribal activity, let's say, before 800 BC, in the time of the Omrides. Had this been the situation of a group of people, scholars, sitting only around the temple and writing, is it possible that nothing, absolutely nothing, leaks to the other media of writing? Please remember that we can expect ostraka. We can expect incised inscriptions. We can expect seal impressions and seals and bulle. Where are all these? I refuse to accept that, yes, according, of course, to those biblical scholars, the composition of biblical text in the temple in the Persian and early Hellenistic was on papyri. So then I'm asking the question about leaking to other media of writing. I refuse to accept that people concentrated near the temple, they wrote only on papyri and nothing leaked outside of these circles for 4 centuries. Absolutely, I don't want to say impossible, until new evidence emerges. Then I'm ready to change my mind. I'll be more than happy to change my mind. As long as we do not have evidence for this, we, I think, should be very careful, exceedingly careful with this proposal.
The Yehud stamp impressions, they have writing on them?
Yes, the Yehud stamp impressions, they have writing, but most of them are in Aramaic script. So we are not speaking about Hebrew script, and we are here back to the same situation regarding Hebrew.
Where does this leave us?
What to do? What to do? There are several options. First of all, I do not deny the possibility of composition of biblical text in the Persian and the Babylonian, Persian and early Hellenistic periods, of course. Many of the compositions could have taken place in the Jewish communities after 586, either in Egypt or in Babylonia. So we are now speaking about Jerusalem and Judea. I will surprise you and I will tell you that I do not even want to deny the possibility of some sort of activity in Jerusalem and Judea, Yehud Judea. Why am I saying this? Because I find it extremely difficult to argue that there was really a break in composition, in writing Hebrew, between 586 and 200 BC. This is not logical, because then the question will be, how did the Hebrew re-emerge in the 2nd century BC? But I think that we need to part from the notion of major activity, composition activity in Jerusalem in the 4th centuries between 586 and 200 BC.
If we are to imagine these texts being composed in Jerusalem at a later time, when could they fit the archaeology?
Yes, we should not be shy of proposing that there is a composition of biblical text in the Hasmonean period. And this should come as no surprise, because we know that the biblical codex has evidence for composition in the 2nd century BC, for instance, the book of Daniel, which is a very good example. Also, another thing to consider is the following. Biblical scholars divided biblical compositions into two according to language, between classical biblical Hebrew in the time of Judah, the kingdom of Judah, and late biblical Hebrew. Second Temple, if you wish, biblical Hebrew, which is, of course, very solid, this assumption. However, we, for the reasons that we have described before in the conversation today and even before, we have no notion whatsoever regarding the exact shift between the classical biblical Hebrew. We don't know, for instance, whether it lasted a little bit after 586, and we don't know when exactly was the change and how gradual the change was. Now, if we shift now to the Hasmonean period, there is logic in this proposal that there is still composition of texts in the Hellenistic, in the Hasmonean period. I will give the details later, I think, but let me just say that we are here back to the question whether historiographic texts of this type are written mainly in time of distress and collapse and calamity, or in time of prosperity, when you need the legitimacy, when you have ideology, when you want to push your ideology, including territorial ideology. I have always been on the side, on the second side, on the second solution, which means that maybe not, perhaps not always, but in most examples are from periods of prosperity, when a kingdom engages in this kind of writing, composition activity in order to fulfill its ideology and its goals, aims, including territory. And in the Hasmonean period, of course, this is evident, because in a very short period of time, after the revolt, after the time of Judah, Maccabeus, starting in 152 BC, the time of Jonathan, into the days of Simeon and then John Hyrcanus, in a very short, several decades, in the second half of the 2nd century, Judea expanded from being a very small territory around Jerusalem in the highlands, as we discussed before, to some sort of a very strong state covering most of the land of Israel, if you wish, which means the Hasmoneans expanded to the south, took over the entire highlands of Judah, including Idumea in the south. We'll be speaking about it. They expanded in the west to the margins of the coastal plain. They took over Gezer and Jaffa with an outlet to the sea there. They took over Samaria. They destroyed the temple of Mount Gerizim of the Samaritans. They took over Samaria itself. And a little bit later, also farther to the north in a very short period of time. So this expansion and this prosperity, which we see in different aspects of material culture, needs to be reflected also one way or the other, in my opinion, in composition of texts, especially legitimacy for this territorial expansion.
Okay, with that in mind, let's turn to the biblical text. I assume we'll use the methodology we've been using during the entire conversation series.
Yes, why not? This is a successful methodology, I think, I believe. And I definitely wish to suggest it to the viewers. I wish now, when we now turn to the biblical text, and we are speaking mainly about Nehemiah and Chronicles, maybe we will say also a few words about Ezra, but Nehemiah and Chronicles, I suggest to pay attention to the geographical compositions, texts, because in geography, and when they mention places, I can always go to the places, check the archaeology of a given location, and then from the archaeology learn something about the possible background of this composition. So let's concentrate on the geography, and in both Nehemiah and Chronicles there's much geography.
Okay, let's do Nehemiah first. Start with the introduction.
Introduction to the book of Nehemiah. The book of Nehemiah can be divided basically into two. There are the first chapters, between the first to the seventh. Scholars are divided exactly on the scope, but still somewhere there, without chapter 3, which should be taken aside, and we'll speak about it later. This first part is the Nehemiah memoir. This is how scholars describe it. And it is written, it has a very peculiar tone, composition, a way of composition, and it speaks in the first body. I mean, Nehemiah speaks, describing his mission. And then we have the rest of the book, several compositions which are not part of this Nehemiah memoir. Now, for the rest of the book, the second part of the book of Nehemiah, many scholars have already suggested in recent years that it can possibly be understood on the background of Hellenistic times, and some even say Hasmonean times. And I'm speaking here about scholars such as Jacob Wright and Deirdre Fulton and Boller and Etienne Naudet from Jerusalem. I hope I am mentioning all those who need to be mentioned. So on this, I think scholars have already agreed in recent years. And recently, another proposal was put on the table in a new PhD dissertation by Diaz Solano, which has not been published yet, but she is putting a very strong case for identifying Hasmonean needs also in the Nehemiah memoir. So this really put the carpet from under the dating of the composition of Nehemiah in, let's say, according to traditional biblical scholarship, in the 5th or the 4th centuries BC. If indeed we identify Hasmonean ideology even in the first chapters in the memoir.
Scholars have pointed out that there's something peculiar about chapter 3, that is the construction of the wall of Jerusalem. Let's look at that one in more detail.
I think that chapter 3 is absolutely essential for all this discussion because it is, first of all, so detailed in geography. It describes the construction of the wall of Jerusalem in details, referring to names of places, gates and towers especially, and also referring to the different hubs of the districts within Yehud, districts and sub-districts. So you have a full expose, if you wish, of the geography there of both Jerusalem and the province around it, be it Yehud or Judea, we will see. Now, we need first of all to say that the idea of the wall, the problem with the fortifications of Jerusalem, is also in the Nehemiah memoir. Nehemiah mourns the situation in Jerusalem, that the walls are destroyed and Jerusalem is so poor and neglected and so on when he comes to visit Jerusalem. So the problem with the wall is mentioned also there. But here we have not only the general problem of the city wall of Jerusalem, but the specific description of construction of the wall. Now, scholars noted long ago that this chapter does not belong to the Nehemiah memoir. It is stuck there in the middle, neither in style, not in the scope of the description, and in the continuity of the description. The question, of course, is when exactly was it inserted into the Nehemiah memoir, and what does it reflect? What's the background for the story? What's the background for this kind of very detailed description, which does not sound an invention of sorts? What's the background, the historical background?
Tell us a little bit about the topography of this wall. Is it describing a big city?
It does describe a big city, absolutely. Thank you for asking this. When you really try to follow the description with the many gates and towers, it becomes crystal clear that we are not dealing only, let's say, with the ridge of the city of David, which is city of David, quote unquote, which is relatively limited in size, and we are not also speaking only about the Temple Mount. We are speaking about a big city. So saying this, of course, we have to keep in mind the fact of the fortifications of Jerusalem in late monarchic times, which encompassed a very big city, including the three parts: the city of David Ridge, the Temple Mount, and the Western Hill. So the question, of course, if this is the case, what's the background for the description? The background, so we can really skip for a minute the issue of when exactly it was inserted into the memoir and only deal with the chapter. There are three possibilities here. The first possibility, in my opinion unlikely, is that there was an author sometime in the Persian or early Hellenistic period who found some sort of text describing the construction of the wall of Jerusalem in the late 8th century BC and inserted it into the book of Nehemiah. Why am I saying unlikely? Because the description does not fit, and in fact also the names. There is a difference between the toponyms of places in Jerusalem in late monarchic times, let's say in the prophetic books of late monarchic times, also in Kings and in this text. Then another possibility which was put on the table is that we are dealing with some sort of utopic description. This is a utopia. In the future, one way, this will be the size of Jerusalem, big Jerusalem of the future. But this too is not a realistic proposal, because we are dealing with a description which is very accurate and refers to specific places and goes, along the line of the fortification, as if somebody is walking along the line and writing and referring to items that he sees along the way. So once we dismiss the two first possibilities, in my opinion, we are left only with a single possibility, one possibility, that what we have here, what we read here, is the description of the construction of the wall by the Hasmoneans in the second half of the 2nd century. This would also explain why the toponyms are different than those of late monarchic times. A composition by the Hasmoneans. Now, how to accept this? Let's put it this way. There is the simple way to accept this. The simple way would be to say that we have a composition, the Nehemiah memoir, let's say from the 4th century BC, 5th, 4th centuries BC. And this composition refers to the deplorable situation of Jerusalem with the city walls destroyed, and Nehemiah comes and wants to reestablish the fortification of Jerusalem in order to protect the city from the enemies round about. And then there is the insertion of a later text into the Nehemiah memoir. This is a very strong possibility, also in view of what can be said on other items in the Nehemiah memoir vis-a-vis other parts in the book of Nehemiah. As long as the memoir is indeed from the 4th and 3rd centuries BC, which we don't know for sure, especially in view of the recent proposal that the Nehemiah memoir also includes items which can be understood only on the background of the needs of the Hasmoneans.
Okay, this sounds logical. One would also want to see how the description of the wall fits the archaeology of the Hasmonean wall. Can these be put together?
Oh yes, I mean the most important I forgot. Almost as usual, I would say, Matt. I forgot to mention or to re-mention, because we spoke about it before, that there is no evidence in Jerusalem for construction of a city wall in the Persian period. I forgot the most important. There is no evidence whatsoever. We have collected the archaeological data on Jerusalem for the last, century at least, if not more. And for the periods in which we do have fortifications, we have very strong evidence for the Middle Bronze, for the later phases of the Iron Age, and for the late Hellenistic period. Walls, as I said before, do not evaporate, especially not stone walls. And there is no single place, even one place on the eastern part of the city above the Gihon Spring, which has recently been suggested by the late Elat Mazar as a possible fortification of the Persian period. There is no evidence there because the discovery was interesting, but the Persian period material came from under the wall or leaning on the wall from the outside. So it tells you nothing about the period of construction of the wall. There is no evidence whatsoever for fortifications in the Persian period. So between we have late monarchic times as one possibility, and then the Hellenistic wall, the Hasmonean wall of the late 2nd century BC on the other side. So we have to choose between the two.
And can we walk around the Hasmonean wall with chapter 3 of Nehemiah and make some sense out of it?
Parts, not all of it, because we don't have the evidence all around. I don't want to go into details now. Let me just tell you that we have pieces of evidence from above the eastern slope of the city of David Ridge. There is one piece of evidence possibly west of the Temple Mount. There are several pieces of evidence from the Jewish quarter, from Mount Zion, here and there. But we do have, the map. We can really establish the map of Hasmonean Jerusalem in the same way that we can establish the map of late monarchic Jerusalem.
The book of Nehemiah provides a real pressing need for this wall, calling out, enemies that are threatening Jerusalem in very specific ways and gives us names. What do you make of this?
This needs to be connected to the question of the wall, exactly. And I think in the same way, one way or the other, there is the list of adversaries of Nehemiah. Here again, I think we should make distinction between the very mention of enemies of Nehemiah in the memoir and the specific names that are referred to in other parts which are possibly not part of the original memoir, if you wish. So there's the general idea, like the general idea of the need of construction of the wall, and then the specific names. The specific names are interesting because they go to all directions. There is an enemy in the north, an enemy in the east, an enemy in the west, and an enemy in the south. And once you have a situation like this, you have to be very suspicious about the ideology behind it, what's going on. Also because the book of Maccabees refers to the idea of enemies round about. So here too we have enemies round about. Sanballat is the enemy in the north. Tobiah is the enemy in the east. Geshem, the Arab, is the enemy in the south. And then we have the Ashdodites with no name. Now, think about poor Yehud that I described to you in our last conversations. With few thousand people stretching from Ramat Rachel to Mitzpah. Are they concerned with enemies round about? Do they have anything to do with the Ashdodites far away on the coast, or with the Arabs who live in the south, in Idumea and farther to the south? There is no, or with the Transjordan, with the enemy, the Ammonites, in the east. There is no logic in this. Also, the names of the enemies are not they do not necessarily all come from the same period of time. This is some sort of an accumulation of memories of enemies, if you wish, of personalities, and they can cover more than, you know, a certain one given time in the history of Yehud Judea. So I suppose that in this case too, the best would be to argue that well, you have two possibilities here too. Either to argue that there is this idea of enemies of Nehemiah in the memoir, which is an earlier text, and then the specific names of enemies which were introduced later on the background of real-time enemies of Judea when it started expanding, that is to say in Hasmonean times. Another possibility, of course, is to say that everything is Hasmonean. Maybe we will refer to it when we summarize the question of Nehemiah. But this is about the adversaries.
Okay. The list of returnees also gives us an opportunity to talk about archaeology and geography. What do you do with this?
Yes, you're right. The list of returnees is another perfect example because, again, this is it opens a possibility for archaeology to be involved, and this is what we like, both of us, I think. Because there is a list of places, we can really actually go from place to place and look for results of excavations or surveys that have been conducted in these places and see what the results were and whether they fit this or that period. Let's do this very quickly. I would say the following. There is a way to identify many of the places in the list of returnees, which means the list appears in two places, both in Nehemiah and in Ezra. And these are the places where people who came back from Babylonia settled, according to the books. So there are those places mentioned, and it is relatively easy to go and seek the archaeology and basically prepare a table. And in a table have 3 columns. This is what I suggest to you. And in the columns, let's have Iron Age 2 BC, Persian period, Persian early Hellenistic, late Hellenistic / Hasmonean. And it is very easy to see that for the Persian early Hellenistic, some of the sites are not at all inhabited or very weakly inhabited, almost nothing. Whereas the strong evidence is for the Iron Age and late Hellenistic / Hasmonean. So I think that also for the list of returnees, the best background is the Hasmonean period.
Okay. Can you summarize then the book of Nehemiah so we can move on?
Who I am to summarize Nehemiah? Who I am? I'm only summarizing here, you know, the view of scholarship today. As far as I understand biblical scholarship and also the input of archaeology that comes from me, among others, I would say that we have two possibilities here. Either to argue for an older text describing the memoir, the Nehemiah memoir, which may have originated from the 4th century BC, let's put it this way, and then insertions of texts in the Hellenistic period in the 2nd century in Hasmonean times reflecting ideology and the situation on the ground in Hasmonean times vis-a-vis the fortifications, vis-a-vis the adversaries and so on. Another possibility is to argue that the entire book of Nehemiah is in fact a Hasmonean composition. And this is if we accept the theories strongly proposed and interestingly proposed by Diaz Solano recently, that she identified the Hasmonean concerns also in the Nehemiah memoir.
Let's turn now to the book of Chronicles.
The book of Chronicles is especially important because it tells the story that had already been told in the books of Samuel and Kings, mainly the book of Kings, especially when we refer to 2nd Chronicles. So why to repeat? First question. The book of Chronicles is, and I put the emphasis today mainly on 2nd Chronicles. 2nd Chronicles is composed of 2 types of texts. First, those texts which repeat the book of Kings especially, about the kings of Judah after the division of the kingdom of the great united monarchy, starting with Rehoboam and continuing all the way to the destruction. And then there are what scholars call the unparalleled texts, which means there are insertions of text in Second Chronicles which do not appear in Kings and which supply us with additional information about what exactly happened in the time of the kings of Judah, which are described there in the chapters of Second Chronicles. And my question would be, why to challenge the authority of kings? Samuel kings. What's the need? Why to add? Why to elaborate? Is the elaboration regarding Judah supported by facts on the ground? If not, what is the background for this elaboration in Chronicles? And this, of course, leads us to the question of the date of Chronicles. Now, this is a very complicated issue, and we don't have the time to deal with it in detail. I have already mentioned before, including today, that scholars suggested dates for Chronicles starting in the 6th century BC and all the way down to the 3rd century. And I also referred to Spinoza, who proposed the dating in the 2nd century BC. And believe me, Matt, I dived into the arguments of why Chronicles cannot date before 200 BC. And I can tell you, to be mild in the way that I describe things, the arguments are not very strong. And they are always in the trap of circular argumentations and, drawing from text which we do not really have, and we have only in many later, compositions, so we don't really know about the original text. It's very complicated. All in all, in my opinion, humble opinion, there is no obstacle in the proposing that at least Second Chronicles, let's put it aside the First Chronicles, but Second Chronicles for sure, why not to date it in the 2nd century in Hasmonean times? Because then there is need, there is reality, there is ideology, there is territory, everything comes together perfectly. Because when now you take, I suggest to you, Matt, go home and take the unparalleled texts and put them on a map, and you see how they describe the expansion, this gradual expansion of Judah from the beginning through the time of Asa to Jehoshaphat to the later kings, how Judah expands and expands and expands. And the next thing to do is to compare it to what we have in the first book of Maccabees. And in fact, you get a mirror picture. You get exactly the same picture, that the expansion of the Hasmoneans parallels the expansion of the kings of Judah in Chronicles, in parts, in texts, which do not appear in Kings. So where does this take us? It takes us to the point that I think we can suggest that the unparalleled texts are aimed at providing legitimacy to the expansion of the Hasmonean state in the second half of the 2nd century, all the way down to the time, in my opinion, of John Hyrcanus. This is also the time reflected in the first book of Maccabees. And as I mentioned to you, we can go really step by step in this.
Can you expand just a little bit on those conquests and what territories we're talking about?
Yes, absolutely. So the book of Maccabees tells you a story as follows: that the expansion starts in the time of Judah. It's only the revolt, and then Judah is killed, and the leadership is in the hands now of Jonathan, his brother. And in the time of Jonathan, there is the story that they play very wisely between the Seleucids at the time, and Jonathan is given the 3 toparchies, the 3 nomoi, the districts which are located a little bit bordering on Judea in the north, to the north. And this comes very interestingly with one of the unparalleled texts in the second book of Kings regarding the history of Judah. Let's not go here into details of Kings because it will be too confusing. And then and Jonathan apparently also started expansion to the Shephelah. And then you have Simeon, his brother, who continues after him. And Simeon expands and takes over Gezer, which was, one of the royal towns, cities of the northern kingdom before, on the way to the coast. And he takes over Jaffa. And taking over Jaffa is very significant because it gives the Hasmoneans an outlet to the sea in the time of Simeon. And then we get the days of the 30 years or so of John Hyrcanus with the boom expansion of Judea in all directions. In the south, Hyrcanus takes over Idumea. In the north, he takes over territories in Samaria. He destroys the temple of the Samaritans at Gerizim. He takes over Samaria itself. And of course, also we have information in the book of Maccabees for the expansion of the Hasmoneans in certain parts of Transjordan on the border with Ammon, if you wish, in the several decades of expansion of the Judean Hasmonean state.
Okay, if we want to try to read Chronicles, or at least this part of Chronicles, as some sort of an attempt to legitimize the Hasmonean dynasty, why do they feel the need to legitimize themselves? Why not just do it?
Good question, because they had to maneuver in a very delicate situation of the different Seleucids, and the danger was not over even the time of John Hyrcanus, and in fact never over, I should say, or almost never over. The real independence of a Hasmonean state is a matter of several decades in the late 2nd century and the beginning of the 1st century until Pompey the Great, of course. So the time is very squeezed here. And there were apparently issues raised by the neighbors, by the enemies round about, by the Seleucids themselves. And here we need to say that the seeking legitimacy is not only a project of Chronicles. Chronicles here is part of a much broader literature of the Hasmonean state, the Hasmoneans in the 2nd century BC, because we can follow this need to explain the territorial issue also in other compositions. Doron Mendels, I think, there was the one who described it in the full, most detailed and fascinating and convincing way. And I am speaking here about texts such as Jubilees, or such as the testimony of the 12 patriarchs of the 2nd century BC. They deal also with this issue of territorial expansion. Please remember, territorial expansion into territories which were not inhabited by Judeans. We can play a game here and ask the question about the composition of the population of the country at the final stage of the expansion of the Hasmoneans. I suppose that much of the population was not Jewish. So the Hasmonean state expanded into territories which were not Jewish. And these issues of legitimacy were always there. There is one place in the first book of Maccabees, which towards the end of the first book of Maccabees, which reflects this in a most beautiful way. I refer here again to Antiochus VII Sidetes, who appears all of a sudden in the early days of Hyrcanus, but he is active also in the later days of Simeon, before, the father of John Hyrcanus. So he comes to Simeon, Antiochus VII, and he says to him, you know, guys, what's wrong with you? You are taking Gezer and Jaffa, they belong to me, and you are doing things also in the highlands, my territories. You have to pay, or I'm coming on you. And Simeon answers him. Well, this is put in the mouth of Simeon by the author of the first book of Maccabees. Simeon tells Sidetes, well, these are territories which belong to us. They belong to our forefathers. They had been taken from us, not in a justified way, and we are taking these territories back, and this is why I have full legitimacy to control these territories. And then he makes a distinction, a very interesting one, between what I once referred in our conversations as core territory and peripheral territory. He speaks about Judea, and then he says to Sidetes, well, about Gezer and Jaffa, I can pay. Which means he makes a distinction between the core territory and those parts which were taken over and are not that important. But basically, this is, I think, the tone of the second book of Chronicles, those unparalleled texts, and in legitimacy for the Hasmonean expansion. And in this, Chronicles is not very different from the body of literature of second century Jewish literature in the 2nd century BC, which is described by scholars as Bible rewritten.
There's one more text in 2nd Chronicles we can look at through this archaeological geographical lens, and those are the forts of Rehoboam.
Absolutely, there is the list of fortifications, forts constructed by Rehoboam in Judah, described only in Chronicles and not in the Book of Kings. And I don't want to say funny, but the peculiar thing is that there are those researchers who take it as a full-fledged historical testimony, although we know already from our previous conversations that we don't really have fortifications in the time of Rehoboam, not even one in the entire territory of Judah. Now, this list is interesting when we look at very carefully at the names, the toponyms. And there are two ways to go here, geography and archaeology again. Geographically speaking, in my opinion, it is clear that it does not refer to the situation of Judah of late monarchic times. There is no fortification in the north, there are no fortifications in the south, which means the places which are of importance to Judah are not covered by the fortifications of Rehoboam. On the other hand, looking very carefully at the names which appear there, I think it becomes crystal clear that we are dealing with, again, needs of the Hasmoneans because of places such as Bethsur, south of Jerusalem, which is very important place in the 2nd century BC. And then there are Marisha and Adoraim, which are important places, at that time. And not only that, the very idea of protecting Judah mainly from the west, this is what we see in the list of forts of Rehoboam, on the different roads that climb the highlands from the coastal plain. The very idea is to protect, I think, the Hasmonean state, Jerusalem and Judea from the west. This was the main danger to Judea at that time. And of course, this is perfectly seen in the incident of that we have already mentioned more than once in this conversation, the assault of Antiochus VII on Judah in the first year of Hyrcanus in power. So all this together points to the Hasmonean period. And then, of course, we take the second step and go to archaeology. And archaeology is very clear about it. On one hand, there are no fortifications in Judah in the time of Rehoboam. On the other hand, those places which can be easily identified and which have been excavated show fortifications from the Hellenistic period. So altogether, this comes together very nicely. And my advice to my fellow researchers, fellow archaeologists, is to take a step back and not jump too very quickly to this list in order to interpret the historical situation in the 10th century BC.
Give us a summary for Chronicles.
Summary for Chronicles, in my opinion, at least for 2nd Chronicles, a composition which supports legitimacy problems of the expansion of the Hasmoneans in the second half of the 2nd century BC. This is beautifully reflected in the unparalleled text and when we do comparative work between the unparalleled text describing the expansion of Judah in monarchic times, to the first book of Maccabees describing the expansion of the Hasmoneans in the second half of the 2nd century. And Chronicles is part of this Bible rewritten phenomenon of Jewish compositions in the 2nd century BC. Of course, I cannot say here that I cannot deny the possibility, especially for the first book of Chronicles, for a somewhat earlier composition.
Thanks. That wraps up today's conversation. And let's just take a few moments then to reflect back on the entire series. We've come a long way over these 26 episodes.
We are tired.
We are tired. If I remember correctly, we started already discussing the Late Bronze Age.
Right.
And we're just now getting to the 2nd century BC. That's 1,000 years plus. Can you wrap all of this up into one statement about Bible and archaeology?
What you said now, Matt, is the most important. We need to make distinction between the scope of the periods described and the actual time of composition. The scope, we spoke, from the very beginning about, the situation at the end of the Late Bronze Age and the conquest of Canaan and the archaeology of the Iron One, and then the situation in the 10th century, and so on and so forth. So we started, I suppose, in the Amarna period, right, in the 14th century BC. So from 1400 BC to 100 BC, we have an interval of 1,300 years. However, this is not the period of the composition, and this is the most important thing to take home lesson from the 26 chapters, is that we make this distinction. And there is no testimony, there is no evidence for composition of biblical text before 800 BC. What I suggested, and we discussed, the two of us, in the 26 chapters of this series, is that is a gradual expansion of biblical historiography, starting in a moment in the first half of the 8th century, when in the Northern Kingdom, when the Northern Kingdom manages, which was the dominant power among the two Hebrew kingdoms, managed to establish this great united monarchy and rule over the entire territory of the two Hebrew kingdoms. This site, Kiryat Yearim, is connected to the legacy, I think, of Israel in the first half of the 8th century. So this is the opening of this composition, biblical historiography. And from there we can identify several stages. So there's this stage in the first half of the 8th century. Possibly there is another stage in the Northern Kingdom which we have not discussed, but let's put it aside. Then we have the arrival of these texts in Judah after the fall of the Northern Kingdom, and the incorporation of these texts into the Judahite composition of late monarchic times in more than one phase. I think that we can speak quite securely about a phase in the late 8th century, and then another one possibly in the time of Manasseh in the first half of the 7th century. You remember our discussion of King Solomon. And then, of course, the Deuteronomistic history, which is the most important, because this wraps up the whole thing, the northern traditions and the southern needs, the southern ideology in late monarchic times, when the north is no more, when the Northern Kingdom does not exist anymore. And this is not the end, because after the destruction, there is the composition of the second Deuteronomistic historian, who tries to explain what exactly happened. And from there we go to the items which we discussed today, which means there is definitely composition in the Persian and the early Hellenistic period. The question is where exactly, whether this happened in Jerusalem or in Egypt or Babylonia. And finally, I think that we can suggest that the final act in this wonderful historiographic overview in the Bible is in the time of the expansion of the Hasmonean state in the second half of the 2nd century. So we have described 7 centuries of biblical compositions with certain similarities between the Iron Age and the Hasmoneans, and the gradual expansion of the Bible as history.
One of the things that really strikes me in all of this, and especially your summary now, is over the course of these 7 centuries, how these people were constantly going back to their own history and looking at it again and thinking about it, all to inform their lives at the time that they're thinking about it again. And I think that's one of the real benefits of looking at this long survey, is to see how people think about their own history.
I agree.
I have really enjoyed these conversations.
Me
I've learned
too.
a lot. I hope others will enjoy them as well. Of course, this is just our last conversation on film. I hope for many more in the years to come.
Thank you very much, Matt, for devoting the time and doing this. I enjoyed it very much. We had a good time. And I think that we should be looking forward to doing something in the future at Megiddo.
Excellent. Bye.